Next, let's add some lights. I'm going to be pretty quick about this. I'm going to add in a target light. I'm just going to call this key because I want this to be my main light. I'm going to set this to be just a tiny bit warm. I'm going to set the type to be area, shadow, area. No, I'm not going to have any shadows on this actually. I'm going to leave diffuse and specular active with an intensity of 100. Okay, my light target, I'm going to just pull this up so it's sort of in the middle of where my object is. And if you think about it, through this, the object itself doesn't actually move, it just spins around. It's the camera that moves, so we don't really need to worry about making sure the lights, light this correctly wherever it is, because it doesn't actually move. Let's just grab this key light. I'm going to press F5 so I can see all of my views. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit on something like so, just so I can see what's going on in all views. And with this light selected, we can just move this around. I've just got these two disabled. Okay, so I probably want this something like so, maybe down a little bit lower. Let's just render that. So you can see it's kind of giving everything a tiny bit of a yellow hue. I'm going to make it more towards white. I really don't want too much color temperature in my light. Okay, that's probably fine. I'm going to control drag to dupe this and call this fill. And the fill light, I'm going to reduce the intensity down. So let's set that to say 65. And let's make it a little bit colder. So that we use this basically to hit the other side. So as it spins round, this light on both sides, we don't get any dark spots. I'm going to make this a little bit colder, something blue, something like that. Okay, and I'm also going to uncheck specular. And let's just pull this round and let's put it down a little bit. So this kind of hits the, it's coming from over here, hitting the left-hand side. So if we come here, we should see that we get some blue light hitting this side of our iPod. And if we switch that off, it's a lot darker that side. So, okay. And if we come here, we should see our key hitting this side. Yeah, cool. So that's probably enough for lights. It would be nice to have a shadow in here. The reason I didn't create a shadow on my key was because I thought what we could do is take our key, just duplicate this, and let's call this shadow. And we can control where the shadow is by switching to our details tab. And here we have an option for shadow caster. And if we enable this, this light won't actually emit any diffuse or specular light. It will simply be used to cast a shadow. And at the moment it's in exactly the same position as our key, but it means we can move it around. And although it's not necessarily natural in how light would work, it means we can design our shot a little bit more. I'm going to set the shadow to be area. Okay, and if we switch to our shadow tab, you can see we have a few parameters for this. I'm actually just going to leave those at default, but the reason I wanted to show you this, because if you're working with the standard renderer, then you adjust the accuracy and minimum and maximum samples here, and you can treat this in a similar way to like your blurry reflections, etc. So you can set your accuracy quite a bit lower probably, but you probably want quite a few samples for that when you're doing your final output, just because it will tend to look a little bit noisy otherwise. So now if we just render and have a look where our shadow is, you can see there it is. So I thought it'd be nicer if we just come up, let's just press F5, and I want to move this round so that the shadow is kind of not quite so long. So I'm going to pull the light up, and let's just test render, and there we go. And you can see that it's sort of going directly back from the product. If you are adjusting lights, one of the things you can do is you can come up and you can access your interactive render region, and this gives you like a kind of not real time, but it gives you quite a quick feedback, and you can also just isolate one part of your viewport like so. So I can choose this, and then if I grab my shadow light, if I move it around, it kind of updates fairly quickly. I don't have to keep switching back to this viewport and hitting render. And you can use this slider on the side to, really reduce the quality down or increase the quality depending on how quick or fast it's kind of behaving. Okay, I'm just going to switch that off. So I do think that, yeah, let's just move it over a tiny bit more. back a little bit. Something like so. That's fine. Okay. Again, you can see how noisy this is, and that's to do with my render settings. But I'm happy with this. We've got some reflection, we've got some shadow. In fact, the reflection on the floor could probably be even brighter because we're going to be able to adjust this in comp. So let's just see what that looks like. And there we go. Add a null. Let's just call this lights, and I'm just going to grab these lights in the target and just drop them into here, and also control drag them onto the lights layer. So now we have all of our lights onto a layer as well. While we're at it, we can also select these materials and we can drag those into our scene layer. So I kind of tend to put everything that's generic into a scene layer and then have specific layers for other elements. And here you can see we've got like some layer hierarchy. So actually if you press control, you can solo everything within that hierarchy, so it affects children as well. Or if you don't, then it only affects the actual object that you're clicking on. Okay, the only other thing that I want to do is add in a white background, because if we render this now, you can see that we're going to have like a black part here, and then we've got this, you know, light beige white area here. And if we cut this out, what could happen, because we're going to be using mats for this, is we could see a slight difference along this edge. So where this horizon is, you know, we might notice that. So it'd be better if we can make all of the background, you know, all white, to be honest with you. Now we could come up and add in a background object, and if we take our floor material, let's just duplicate this and call this white. I'm just simply going to switch to the basic tab and disable reflection. If we drag this onto our background, and let's just put that onto our scene layer as well and render, and you can see now we have this white background. The problem with this is if we use multipass, then this won't render as in any of the channels, because it isn't part of the diffuse render or anything like that. It's actually it's a special type of object. So I'm not going to use a background object here. After all that, I'm going to actually take my floor and just control drag to create a floor, and I'm going to call this floor background. Now this isn't necessarily the right way to do this. There's loads of different ways you can approach this. I'm just simply showing you one method that will open up the world of possibilities of working with the After Effects Exchange. I'm going to set the pitch on this to 90, and let's just switch to our side view and grab this floor. We just set that to like 1000 on Z, so it's back in the distance. And there we go. Okay, so it's all looking a bit grey. We've still got a line there. One of the other things that we can do is we can use what's called external compositing, and this is an option that you can use so that the lights don't affect the object as far as illumination goes. So if we put like red on it, it will just stay that flat red all over, but you can still use it with catching shadows and reflections and things like that. And that's exactly what we want to do for this scene here. So if we select the floor and the floor background and choose tags, Cinema 4D tags, and add in a compositing tag, and under the tag tab you can see we have this option, compositing background, and I'm just going to enable that. And if we render now, you can see that the background comes out pure white. Now you can't really see the shadow very clearly here, and the reflection looks as if it's totally disappeared, but because we're going to be using multipass and we're going to be replacing the background anyway, I'm not really going to worry about that. We're going to do a couple of test renders to make sure everything is working as it should be, and then hopefully it will all be okay. But we're going to test that before we like move on anyway. Let's take this camera, nylon camera, and just put that onto our camera layer. So we've got everything on layers. Now what we want to do is we want to replace this screen. So what we can do is we can take this screen. If we open up the iPod hierarchy, there we have our screen object, and we can add a tag to this so that this is exported to After Effects as a null object. And when we open that into After Effects, into our comp, we'll have the camera from this scene, and we'll have a null object, and we can then use that null object and we can parent a solid to it, or we can simply swap it out for a solid, and it will have all the position rotation values from this object, which means that the 3D will match, it will move the same. We can then simply swap that out for some new graphics. Now of course we have like this shape around the iPod screen, and if I render, you can see it's got this black border. It looks a bit noisy here, but we've got a black border, etc. So what we could do is we could kind of rotate this and create a mask in After Effects. but you know, that's going to be a bit of a pain. It's a funny shape, it's slightly curved, so as it kind of rotates, you know, we're going to have to do some roto and stuff. We don't want to do that. So what we can do is we can kind of create a mat for that as well. So we can not only have our 3D solid, we can also have a mat to cut that solid out so that it sits inside the screen, or it gives the illusion that it's sitting inside the screen. So we're going to want to create a mat for that as well. Okay, now I've set this up, and if we open up our iPod Hypernerbs, in here you can see I've got screen glass, and this is the object, and I've hidden it at the moment, but if we unhide that, and you can see, there we go, and you can see there's the black border that I was talking about, and you can see that the actual screen itself, if we come to our top view and just frame that, you can see the screen itself, there it is, just move that, okay, is slightly behind the screen glass, and the screen glass is sitting on the front. So we can use this screen glass as our mat. If we render out a mat for this, and we render out the position, or we export the position and rotation of our screen, then we should be okay when we get to After Effects. So if you want to take an object in Cinema 4D and make sure that that object is part of the 3D data that is exported, you simply add an External Compositing tag to the object. So you select the object, you come to the Tags menu, you choose Cinema 4D Tags, and you add External Compositing. Now you need to make sure it's the External Compositing tag, not the Compositing tag. The Compositing tag is for controlling things like scene by reflection, scene by refraction, creating object buffers, all those kind of things. External Compositing is for telling Cinema 4D that you want to export the information from that object. Now we've got a few parameters in here. We can create a solid, we can set the size of it, the color of it, we can change whereabouts the anchor point is when it comes into After Effects. We can also enable children, which will export all the children of that object. There's a cache option here which will allow us to export clones and things like that. This is just one single object. I'm just going to add that tag, and I'm actually just going to leave all the settings as it is. We could probably adjust the anchor point, which would be more useful, but I'll leave that for you guys to experiment with how that works when you change that. It's pretty self-explanatory anyway. Exporting the position rotation data for that object is one thing, but as I said, we also need a map for that object. In fact, we need a map for the whole phone, because we've got these background elements in there, especially the floor, which we're using to catch the shadow and also to catch the reflections, but we want this to have an alpha channel essentially, but we can't have an alpha and have the floor in there. So what we can do is we can create a map for our object, and we can just use that as a track mat when we're in After Effects. So to do this, we use a compositing tag, and we've already used some compositing tags down here. But if we select the iPod at the very top, the null object, choose Tags, Cinema 4D Tags, Compositing, and we add a compositing tag. Switch to the Object Buffer tab, and here we can enable object buffers. And an object buffer is basically a mat. It's a black and white render of the object that you can then use to mask that out in your compositing application. And this will work with any application that will support mats. So I'm just going to enable Object Buffer 1. So all of the children will be included in that. Now the other thing I want to do is have a map for the screen. So if we select the screen and we come up and we add in another compositing tag, and what I want to do is I want a separate map for this. So I'm going to choose Object Buffer 2. Now the problem with doing this, if you're not careful, is what will happen is Object Buffer 1 here won't include the screen now, because we've set that as Object Buffer 2. So you can actually set an object to be on more than one buffer, so it's on more than one mat. Now of course you could take both of these mats in After Effects and combine them using add or something like that, and hopefully it would be fine. You might get a little bit of a seam where the anti-aliasing is, where the two mats join up, but you should be okay. But in this example, the simplest thing to do is just say, okay, well I want to include this screen object. I want to include that on my object buffer number 1 and my object buffer number 2. So we just enable buffer 1 as well. So now this will be written to the object buffer 1, which refers to the whole the whole iPod object, and it will also be on object buffer 2, and there won't be anything else on object buffer 2. So now we've got the position and rotation, and we've got a mat for our screen, and we've also got a mat for our iPod as well. So we just need to set up our render settings, do a couple of quick tests to make sure everything looks as it should, and if that's okay, then we can output and move over to After Effects. Open up the render settings, which you can access from the render menu. Edit render settings. I've just got them docked behind my viewport here. Now I'm going to select multipass and enable. I'm going to come down to the multipass button here, which is actually a menu of elements that you can include. And first of all, we can add RGBA image. Now we probably don't even need that, but that's just basically a flattened version of your render. We then need to add all the different passes that we've used. And if you're unsure about doing that, what you can do is you can actually choose multipass, add image layers, like so. And this will add all of them for you. Probably you don't need all those. For instance, we don't have any post effects, we don't have any atmosphere, we don't have caustics, we're not using GI, we don't have any ambient occlusion. We do have refraction, reflection, shadow, and we also have specular. I'm not sure if we'll see any specular. And we have diffuse and we have some ambient. So these refer to such as like your luminance channel, your color channel, your specular channel, shadows from lights, and obviously your reflection and your transparency. So if you're unsure, add them all, do some test renders. Any that come out pure black you probably don't need, but you might need them on another frame. You know, so once you've done this a few times, you'll get the hang of it. The other thing is just to check your materials and see what channels you've used, and you can normally tell from, you know, the channels that are enabled. I'm going to just come to output and set this to current frame for now. And I think this is a fairly good frame to do a test on. We can see the reflection, we should be able to see the shadow. It's at a slight angle, so we should get some interaction from the lights. We can see our background, etc. So we can just make sure that everything's working. We can check all the channels. Back in the render settings, under the save option. Now we've got two options up here, regular image, save. We don't actually need to enable that. We're not going to save a regular image. We're just going to save multipass. If we uncheck multipass, you can see that disappears at the bottom there. So what we want to do is enable this, save multipass. And I'm going to use Photoshop. You can choose to use any other format you like. Now Photoshop's pretty handy because it's reasonably small, it's lossless, and also it will have an embedded color profile, so all of those things are quite handy. It's not the only format that will support that, for sure, loads will, but I'm just going to use Photoshop. Now because we're using linear workflow, and if we just choose Command or Control D to open up our project settings, you can see here linear workflow is enabled. And multipass. What that means is that what we have to do is we have to work in 16-bit. If we work in 8-bit, chances are we're going to see some banding in our render, and that's not really what we want. It's going to look pretty poor. So if you do use linear workflow and multipass, it's pretty important to output 16-bit. Now there's another thing that's really important as well, and this is the image color profile. Now at the moment you can see it's set to sRGB, and sRGB is pretty much the standard that most applications write images to, and you know, Cinema 4D by default, any input images it sets to sRGB. It's kind of guessing that they are, and it looks at that and says, is there an embedded profile? And if there isn't, it will use sRGB. So you need to be sure to use either sRGB or embedded profiles in your images. If not, you need to make sure that you either change this or you know, change the color profile on individual images. We're not worrying about images coming in at the moment, we're just worrying about images going out, so we're looking at our render settings. Now, if you render a flat image, you can set this profile to be whatever you want, but if you are working with linear workflow and you're outputting multipass, you need to ensure that this is set to linear. Now the reason for that is because what's happening is that the render engine normally would render all the separate passes, and it would then composite them internally in linear color space, and it will flatten that, and then you get your rendered image, and that's how it kind of works in theory. However, in this example here, we're taking the place of the renderer, you know, of that part of the process. The renderer is going to be rendering all the different passes, but it's not going to be compositing them in linear color space and flattening it and saving it out. It's going to be saving all the passes separately. So we need to make sure that we composite those in linear color space. So the first part of that equation is to make sure that we output them in linear color space. And that's as simple as simply setting our image color profile to be in linear color space. Okay. So we've got Photoshop, 16-bit, linear color space. I've unchecked multi-layer file. I don't want all of my Photoshop, all my multipass layers as layers within Photoshop. You could do that. Later versions of After Effects do support you know, importing multi-layered sequences. But for this example, we're not going to. This is probably the quickest way to get After Effects to read them as separate files. It will probably result in more disk space used up, and the number of files that you'll have to manage will be a lot bigger. So it really depends on the project, whether or not you use layered files, whether you use Photoshop or EXRs, or whether you render all your passes separately or as layers. That's something for a totally different tutorial, but you know, for this example, I'm using Photoshop separate files. If we fold down the compositing project file at the bottom here, we have the option to save, and our target application is After Effects, and you can see that there's quite a few others that are actually supported. And we want to include 3D data. Now you don't need to worry about checking any of the others, but you can export, you know, this relative to your render, or you can include any markers that you've added in your timeline and those kind of things. You don't have all of these options, and the target applications do change depending on the version of Cinema 4D that you're using. Okay, so that's all set up. We need to give it a name. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to uncheck save for now, because I don't want to save this yet. I just want to do some test renders. So now I've done all that. Before I do any test renders, I'm going to save the actual project just in case there are any problems, and then we can do a few test renders and make sure all our passes are set up correctly. Now I can't really stress enough how important it is to do test renders. It's amazing the number of people that set all their render settings like just really high, and they've got like a 500 frame animation, and it's Friday, and then they just hit render, and then they clear off for the weekend, come back on a Monday and realize that actually it looks terrible. You know, that it hasn't rendered, it's only rendered 6 frames out of the 500, and you know, they've forgotten to switch something on, or it's the wrong color, or you know, all sorts of things. And if they'd have just spent a little bit of time within the process to do test renders, you know, everything would be okay. And now the first thing I would say is to just render some stills like we're going about to do now. And the next thing I would say is to keep your render settings as low as possible, like awful quality that you would never show anyone, and render out the whole thing, render out the whole animation, just so you can see everything and make sure it all looks right. You know, it will render in like a tenth of the time, probably quicker, and you'll see your whole animation then. And then if you're happy with that, you know, it's only taking you an hour or so, and great, you can now bump all the settings up, and you can, you know, leave it for the weekend, and you can be sure that what you get at the end of it is what you're expecting. And it can save a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in the studio. So I've unchecked save. I'm just going to go and hit render to picture viewer. My picture viewer is opened up on this other monitor. Let's just pull this over, and you can see, there we go. So it's looking exactly as it did in the editor view, with this pure white background and our iPod. If we come over to this side here, we can choose layer, and you can see here are all our different layers. At the moment it's just viewing image, but if we select single pass, we can click on different passes and we can have a look, and you can see, okay, reflection, and we've got some reflection going on here, and we ambient, there's our ambient, which is the Luma shader. We've got some shadow, and we've got nothing in our spec here, and we've got some diffuse. But the problem immediately here is that the reflection needs to be all black. We don't want to have any of this white floor. So there's something going wrong there. Other than that, it all looks okay. The problem is just that we have, like, our reflection just looks wrong. You know, if I want to take this into After Effects and add this over the top of another layer, then all this white is going to become part of that reflection it's going to destroy the idea that I have. I want this to only show the reflection on my iPod, or the reflection on the floor, and none of this other stuff. Now I think what's happening here is the floor is reflecting the sky, and they're probably reflecting each other. So let's have a look at what I've done. So the first thing that I've done wrong is on my floor background I have this texture tag, which is the floor texture tag, and if we come to the scene here, I've got this white one. I just want to drag that one on there, so we don't have any reflection on our background. We can also select this, and we can come to tag, and we can uncheck seen by rays. We don't want this background to be seen by any of our reflections or transparency. We just want it to be a white background. I'm going to double click on the traffic lights to hide the iPod and just render again. And the reason for that is just because it's going to render loads quicker. So you can see that the floor is still reflecting probably the sky, but the back object is okay. And if we look at our diffuse, we've got like a nice white background, but we've still got a problem with our reflection. We don't want to see this either. This needs to be black. Okay, so if we have a look at our scene, what we can do to check this is let's just hide our sky. If we hide our sky and we render and it's all black, then that pretty much tells us that the object reflecting in our floor is our sky object. And there we go, that's come black. So what we need to do is we need to restrict our reflections. Lucky for us, we have compositing tags, and the compositing tag allows us to include or exclude certain objects from reflections, refractions, those kind of things. And we can also use it to include or exclude hierarchies. So if we come to our sky object and we select our compositing tag, if we switch to the exclusion tab, you can see here we've got this mode exclude include, and we have this big field where we can drag and drop objects into. So basically you say, okay, I want this to be reflected in this object but not in this object. So we only want the sky to actually be reflected in our iPod. So there's a couple of things we could do. We could either exclude everything else, or we could just include the iPod. So if we set the mode to be include and we drag our iPod into this field, now what should happen is that only the iPod will reflect the sky. And you can see here we've got some little icons, and the first one is for transparency, the next one is for refraction, and this one is reflection, and this one is hierarchy. And you can switch on them, you can click on them, sorry, and you can see they go a little bit dimmer, and that sort of enables and disables this. So you could say only include reflections, don't include the sky in refractions and that kind of thing. So this offers us another level of control with our scene. So if we just unhide our iPod and let's render now, okay, and you can see that I still just have the reflection channel active, and there we go. And you can see now that we've got all black in our reflection, but we're reflecting the sky, and our floor is still reflecting our iPod. If we look at the image, everything looks okay. You can also see that now the floor isn't reflecting the sky, that the shadow is showing up a lot more. Looks pretty grainy. And I know in this version you can't see any of the reflections, but we can check them, you know, in our single passes. And you can switch to the multipass option here, and you can kind of switch your different layers off, or you can select them and adjust the opacity of them, just to see, you know, how you can kind of manipulate all your different passes. And this is exactly what we will be doing in After Effects very shortly. So I'm pretty happy with this being set up correctly. There are a couple of things that I have missed out which are pretty important, and those two things are our object buffers. So if we come to render settings and we come down to multipass, you can see here we have the option to add object buffer. So if we add an object buffer here, it has an ID, and this ID corresponds to the number that we've set on our compositing tag. So here we have our iPod with our compositing tag, and we have enabled buffer 1. And if you remember, we also have one on our screen, and in here we have enabled buffer 1 and 2. So we need to add the object buffer pass twice. So we've got one with group ID 1, and we've got another one with group ID 2. And you can actually rename these in here, just so that you know that the name of it here corresponds to the number that you've used. Unfortunately, you know, you can't rename these screen, or you can, but it won't reflect in the rendered file. It'd be great if it did, but we can just write a list of what number refers to which object, or in fact there's only 2, so it's not going to be too difficult. When you've got, you know, 40 or 50 of those, it becomes a little bit more to manage. Okay, so I've done that. The other thing I want to do is come down to my physical tab, and I'm going to set the shading error threshold to be, say, 5, and I'm going to set these to be like 2.5. So it's going to take a lot longer to render this now, but I'm going to render one more frame and just make sure that everything is set up correctly. Okay, and you can see it's still like reasonably quick, and now like the edges are starting to look nicer. You can see the shadow down here isn't anywhere near as grainy, and hopefully when we see our reflection, you know, you can see that that's also looking a lot smoother. So we could maybe increase the blurriness a little bit. You know, it does look a tiny bit noisy, but I would take this and test it in Composite and see what it looks like, because probably you won't notice that grain once it's all comped together. The other thing that we can check when we're in here, single pass, we can say, okay, here's object buffer 1, that's the whole of the iPod. Here's object buffer 2, that's just the screen. So our buffers are working correctly as well. As I said before, it's really important to do this before you commit to a render, because you know, I forgot that I'd missed out the object buffers. Like, this is the whole point of the tutorial and I missed it out, but because I checked my frames, you know, I knew I'd made a mistake and it's easily rectified. If you wait until you've rendered all your frames, then that is not so easy to fix. Okay, so that's cool. I'm going to come up, save incremental. I can now come to the save options and enable save. I need to add in a path in here. I'm just going to call this C4D to AE basic, and save again. Now you would probably normally set a path in here, but I'm going to render this using net, so what I normally do is I would put the version number and then copy this name and then come up, save project with assets, save it into my net render folder, and then all of my renders have the same file name as the version number. So as I increment the version of the scene, the render output name increments as well, and it's easy to look at a render that you've done earlier and work out which project it came from. So let's render this out, and then we can have a look at the output and move over to After Effects.